Rick. Good to be back here with you. And hey, you got a book?
I got a book. It's good to be back. It's good to kind of dive into one more little episode of stuff and continue to kind of further people along in their exploration of maybe the ultra world.
I've been training the whole time we've been doing these because you're sitting with my arms like.
That's hey, you get your training in where you can get it, right? So today we're going to talk about something that's kind of an odd topic, but I kind of feel it should be addressed even though there's no actual true answer to it. And that is, what is ultra? At least in the cycling world.
I think you would get a lot of different answers on that question.
I have heard as many as you could possibly imagine. And I think what we'll do is, I'm going to read a quick quote out of Michael Shermer, one of the original 4 RAAM racers. It's a book he wrote talking about Race Across America and kind of the history of it. And I'll read the quote, and then we'll talk a little bit about how, at least in my, in my opinion, kind of the scope of what ultra means in the world of maybe ultra racing, bicycle, not running. That's their own world, but we'll talk about it in kind of the scope of cycling. But I'll read Lon Haldeman's quote, and then we'll define it a little bit beyond what Lon said. But I do agree a lot with Lon. So what Lon said was, the cycling term long distance or ultra marathon is relative to your own perception of mega miles. As a 10-year-old boy, I thought I was a long distance cyclist when I rode to the next town 3 miles away. So as a 10-year-old, 3 miles is pretty dang far, right?
It's an adventure riding to school.
Absolutely. And so, when you get into these things, I remember my first 50-mile ride. I remember, which was awesome. I rode Rosarito and Ensenada with my dad. It was super fun. I remember my first century. It was a ride for the Roses down in Austin, Texas with Lance Armstrong. So again, at the time, those were big deals to me. They were farther than I'd ever considered riding. And, you tell your friends that you do that, they're like, wow, that's nuts, right? But in the world that both you and I live in currently, you look at a 50-mile ride and they're like, well, what's the big deal? We do that every day.
Most of your friends, though, after you come back from RAAM, are like, whoa, that's nuts.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just kind of break down the scope of it. We're not going to delve into this for hours because you can ultimately define it on how you want. And the idea is, in my opinion, always push yourself. Push yourself to whatever level you think is the best. But I think for the sake of today, we'll look at it kind of in a road racing situation and then kind of a time trial situation because they're very different aspects. So let's maybe touch time trial first.
Okay. So time trials. Normally think of a 40K. That's what I think most of the 50 states do for USCF or whatever sanctioning body that states are using. It used to be a really big deal before anything aero to break an hour.
Yeah. So that was pushing the limit. And again, those guys are crushing speeds that are ridiculous, and especially pros and like Tour de France racers.
We're talking 40-ish minutes.
Yeah, 40 minutes to an hour, let's say, and they're riding exceptionally hard. I'm not taking away from people like Usain Bolt. It's not like he trains any less than someone like Scott Jurek doing 100-mile plus races. They're just different racing. But for the definition of ultra, I like to look at ultra time trial racing kind of starts at 6 hours because that's a pretty big jump from an hour to 6 hour racing. And there aren't a lot of 3-hour races out there. There are a few. There you go. There are a few. And that could certainly arguably be an ultra event. I would not dismiss it. 3 hours in a TT position is not easy.
But it's part of my time trial weekend.
Yeah, so
people like it, but I bill it as a training weekend.
Yep, and so 3 hours, only because there's not a lot of them out there. I would kind of define ultra starts at about a 6 hour time trial. But if someone said, well, ultra's 3 hours, not going to argue with that. It's hard, because most of the standard traditional racing distances are roughly an hour or less. And I think if you were to come out to any of the 6, 12, 24-hour races, whichever one you might go to, and watch these people race, 6 hours in a TT position is no joke. And they are racing exceptionally hard, and they're tapped.
Watching the 6 at Borrego is no kidding. That's an intense race.
Yeah, it's hard, and for most of those people at a race level, that's pretty much pushing it. And yes, I understand, like Ironman, bike courses are, kind of in that 3 to 6 hour range, depending on how hilly it is. But I think that's a good starting point for defining what ultra is, and beyond that, they just get longer and harder. But again, we go back to some of our previous discussions, your training, preparation, nutrition, all that stuff changes for that. But for the sake of argument, I like to define ultra time trial racing 6 hours, starting point. Road racing is an interesting one because it has never really had a map to racing. It's not like running where you really have 5K, 10K, half marathon. And then I think most ultra kind of is defined anything longer than a marathon distance. Right. Cycling has never really done that very well, I don't think. So when I look at road racing,
because you're right, it was really tours that did the 25, 50, 100K, 100.
Yeah, and so that was kind of it.
Century.
Yeah, Century. And it kind of stopped there. It really never, you didn't see a lot of things beyond 100. And, certainly the Gran Fondo, which started in Europe and eventually got to the United States. Gran Fondos in the United States are really kind of a new concept, but even those are generally about 100 to 130 miles. We have things here like the triple bypass that are 125, I think. So somewhere in that ballpark is kind of where I consider a normal standard of riding racing, stage racing. You might have some really long stage races that are pushing 100 miles, but I don't think too many that I know of. So I kind of like to define ultra racing as a starting point at about 200 miles. I think that's a good baseline to say, yeah, you're kind of hitting the ultra world at that point.
And when you're saying road, I mean, like, I think the RAO 260 is certainly ultra, but the entire event is time trial. You can't draft. So,
right.
But you're not looking at that like you are with the 6 hour.
No, they're different. I look at first of all, when I talk about ultra racing, I look at racing being you have a starting time and you have a cutoff time. It's not an open-ended event, and so because that changes how you approach the riding part of it. I think if you have a cutoff, you're obviously ready. You need to get to that. Yeah, and if you have an open-ended, it doesn't really matter. You can go do whatever you want, get back on your bike 3 days later and go if you want. So,
and there are some events that are open-ended out there.
Absolutely. And so 200 miles, I look at it as, yes, generally non-drafting. Whether you have a support crew or not doesn't really, I don't think matters that much necessarily. There are good aspects to not having one. There are good aspects to having one, and bad to both as well. But I like 200 as a starting point because I know a lot of people like to define it as 500 miles because that was traditionally where the ultra qualifying events for RAAM started. I think it's too big of a leap for most people to wrap their heads around to go from even 150 to 500. And I think 200 is really kind of pushing most people's limits.
I think you start noticing some bodily changes at 200 miles.
Yeah, I think that's it too. Like, I think at that point you are noticing training differences, food differences, equipment differences. That's really where the tipping point is and where your body reacts differently. And so I'll go with my opinion at a 6 hour time trial, ultra. 3 hour, definitely accept that argument as an ultra. I think 200 miles is a really good starting place for an ultra race. If you want to, split hairs about it, sure, you can get down a little lower. But just as a standard event benchmark, I like the 6 hour and 200 race distance.
You know what division of cycling really got the build up right? It was Ron Denurin.
Yeah, they did a really good job.
200K, 300K, 400K, 600K, and then you can do the 1200K.
Yep, they're a really good progression of sports distances. And again, you know, you can argue whether a 200K is ultra or not. You know, ultimately, it's just a matter of opinion. But again, just for the general sake of putting on events and you want to define what you're doing, I don't think a Grand Fondo would decide, you know, even though it's a timed event or parts of it are timed, they would not define themselves ultra. I think when you get to 200s, it's a really gray area because there's not tons of them out there unless you're in California. But I think at that point, you're really pushing a limit that most casual cyclists are not riding.
Oh, I'm looking at a 200 miler on gravel.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you get into gravel, a whole different world. Mountain biking, a whole different world. Of course, you know, you get into, you know, how hard it is to ride on road versus dirt. You know.
And you did say road.
Yep. So again, all arguable distances. You know, and what I want to see people do, go enjoy themselves, go push their limits, go try something new. Don't get caught up in the terminology. The only reason we're even kind of discussing this is because we get asked.
Yep.
And so take that for what it is, enjoy it, go be a friend with your bike and go ride because, you know, if riding down to your grocery store is challenging for you, good on you, go do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool, I think that's it. And until next time,
Thanks for
we'll say
tuning in.
goodbye.